Welcome to grim fiction, where darkness meets tranquility. Here, we weave haunting tales set to the soothing sound of rain, perfect for those who crave a touch of the eerie to drift off to sleep. Every night, immerse yourself in new stories that blend the mysterious with the calming, transforming your nights into a journey through the shadows. Subscribe now and let the rain carry you into a world of chilling tales posted daily, just for you. Lila loved solitude. It was the reason she often chose to hike alone, leaving behind the distractions of daily life to immerse herself in the stillness of nature. On this crisp October morning, she set out before dawn with a well-worn backpack and a map she'd printed off the internet. Pine Hollow Woods was vast and, according to local legend, a little too mysterious for most. But for Lila, the prospect of finding the infamous, almost mythical, hidden lake was thrilling. The morning air was cool and carried the sharp scent of pine. She felt at ease as her boots crunched against the dirt trail, the sun casting long shadows that danced on the forest floor. With each step, the sounds of the outside world receded, replaced by the whisper of leaves and the occasional cry of a far-off bird. It was perfect. Or at least it was until the trail began to change. The path she'd been following so confidently grew less distinct. Small shrubs and moss-covered rocks now littered what should have been a clearly marked route. The trees, too, seemed denser here, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as though they had grown in defiance of the natural order. Lila's confidence wavered as the path faded entirely, leaving her to navigate by intuition and the faint hints of a trail on the forest floor. She pressed on. She wasn't one to turn back easily, not when she felt so close. According to her map, the lake should be just beyond the next ridge. The thought of finding it, of seeing the glassy water for herself, untouched and pristine, kept her moving. But the woods grew quieter with each passing minute. The usual forest sounds, rustling leaves, chirping birds, distant rustles of unseen animals were absent. The silence pressed in on her, and with it came a sense of unease. Finally, she crested a small hill, and the forest opened up. Before her lay a clearing, and in the center of it, the lake. She stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. The water was so dark it was nearly black, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky and trees like a mirror. The air here was colder, sharper. She noticed how the surrounding trees leaned inward as if drawn toward the water's edge, their roots dipping into the muddy bank. Lila approached cautiously. The lake's stillness was unnerving. She crouched near the edge, peering into the depths. There was no sign of fish or plant life, just that endless glassy surface. Her reflection stared back at her, pale and distorted, as though the water was a sheet of dark glass rather than something alive and natural. Then came the ripple. It started small, a faint tremor at the center of the lake. Lila froze, her heart hammering. There was no wind, no fallen leaf or darting fish to explain it. The ripple grew, spreading outward in slow, deliberate rings. She took a step back, her instincts finally telling her this wasn't right. That was when she heard the first whisper. It was faint, like the rustling of leaves, but there was no wind here. It grew louder, clearer, until it sounded almost like her name. Lila. The voice was soft and melodic, carrying an eerie familiarity. She glanced over her shoulder, expecting to see someone there, but the forest remained empty. The voice came again, this time more insistent. Lila. She backed away from the lake, her hands trembling. The whisper continued, now layered with other voices, murmuring indistinct words that seemed to hum in her very bones. It was all she could do to keep from running. But before she turned to flee, her eyes caught a flash of movement. Something pale and slow broke the lake's surface. A hand, or something that resembled one, rose briefly before disappearing beneath the glassy water. Her breath caught. She turned and sprinted into the woods, the whispering voices following her, faint at first, then growing louder, more urgent. No matter how fast she ran, they stayed with her, wrapping around her like a cold wind. The lake in its unnatural stillness faded from view, but its presence lingered in her mind. And in the deepest part of her thoughts, she heard it again, her name, carried on a voice that didn't belong in the waking world. Lila pressed on, weaving through the towering pines that seemed to close in tighter with every step. The whispers were faint at first, no more than the suggestion of a voice, like the rustling of dry leaves or the distant sigh of the wind. But as she moved deeper into the forest, they began to take form, threading through the trees, faint yet unmistakable. Lila, she stopped short, her breath clouding in the cool air. The sound was impossible to pinpoint. It wasn't coming from behind her or ahead of her. It was all around, as if the trees themselves were murmuring her name. Her heartbeat quickened, each thud loud against the eerie stillness. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. Silence answered her. She strained her ears, listening for the crunch of footsteps, a rustle in the undergrowth, anything that might explain the voice. But the forest was unnaturally quiet, save for that whispered name. It came again, more insistent, like a child calling from the shadows. "Leela, come back." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. Maybe it was a trick of the wind or the echo of her own voice. Maybe she'd imagined it entirely. But as the whispers grew clearer, threading together into a haunting melody of voices, she knew it wasn't her imagination. This was real, and it was getting closer. Leela, her legs felt frozen, her instincts screaming at her to run. But the voice, it sounded familiar now. Not just one voice, but several, layered and overlapping. And buried within that chorus, she recognized her mother's voice, soft and pleading. "Lila, come back to the lake." Her breath hitched. Her mother had passed years ago. She knew it couldn't be her. It was impossible, but the familiarity of it struck a chord deep within her. Against all logic, she felt compelled to follow the voice. She took one hesitant step forward, then another, the whispers growing louder with each movement. They weren't calling her back to the trail. They were calling her back to the lake. "Come back." She stopped in her tracks, her sense of reason wrestling against the overwhelming pull of the voices. "No," she said aloud, her voice steadier than she expected. "No, you're not real." But the voices didn't fade. Instead, they changed. They no longer beckoned her softly. They laughed cold, sharp laughter that twisted her stomach. Then, just as suddenly as they had begun, they stopped. The forest was plunged into an even deeper silence. She held her breath, listening. That's when she felt it. A sudden icy chill against her ankle. Looking down, she saw a pale, slimy tendril of something, a root, a vine coiling gently around her boot. She jerked her foot back, stumbling and falling hard onto her hands and knees. The whispering resumed, louder now, filled with a frantic urgency. And for the first time, she felt sure she wasn't alone. The forest no longer felt like the familiar place she loved. The trees loomed like giants, their twisted limbs reaching down toward her. She scrambled back to her feet, brushing dirt and pine needles from her hands. The voices were louder now, rising to a fever pitch, overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "Lila! Lila!" they screamed, no longer coaxing, but demanding. She turned and ran. Her boots pounded the uneven ground, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The whispers followed, no longer a distant sound but a living presence in her ears, pushing her forward. As she ran, the trees seemed to blur, their dark forms twisting and bending in her peripheral vision. She stumbled over roots and rocks, barely staying upright. Finally, she broke through the dense underbrush and into a small clearing. The voices fell silent once more, and she paused to catch her breath. Her knees trembled, and she wiped the sweat from her brow. The silence was overwhelming, pressing down on her like a weight. She wanted to believe it was over, that she had escaped whatever force was chasing her. But deep down, she knew better. The forest around her remained still. No birds, no wind, not even the rustle of leaves. Just the faint sound of her own breathing and the thundering of her heart. And as she stood there, frozen in the silence, a new sound emerged. Not a whisper this time, but something deeper, darker. A low, guttural laugh that echoed through the trees. And then, from the shadows, she heard it again. Lila bolted, sprinting deeper into the woods without a second thought. Her pulse roared in her ears as she pushed through the thick undergrowth, barely able to see where she was going. The laughter low and rumbling rolled after her, keeping pace. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, heavy and oppressive, as if the forest itself was mocking her. Her feet snagged on unseen roots, nearly sending her sprawling. She caught herself against a tree, gasping for breath, and dared a glance behind her. Nothing, no movement in the shadowy forest. The laughter had stopped, replaced once again by the whispers. They were quieter now, faint and almost soothing, but that only made them more unsettling. They didn't sound angry anymore. They sounded patient, "Lila, it's so quiet here, just stop." A shiver ran down her spine. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to make sense of the direction she'd come from, but everything looked the same. The trail had disappeared, and the landmarks she'd passed before, twisted trees, moss-covered rocks, had blended into the dark expanse of forest around her. She was completely turned around. The ground sloped downward, and she followed it instinctively. Maybe it would lead to water. Maybe she'd find a stream that would help her get her bearings. She moved carefully now, her boots crunching softly on the pine needles. Every step felt like it carried her deeper into something she couldn't understand, something that wanted her to stay. Then the whispers stopped. It was as if the forest itself had inhaled and held its breath. Lila froze. The silence was suffocating, too complete. No rustling branches, no chirping insects, just the muted sound of her own heartbeat. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the dense trees. Nothing moved. And then she felt it. Something cold brushed her ankle. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her yelp and jump back. Her eyes darted downward. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, but the cold touch lingered, a creeping sensation that sent a prickle of fear up her legs. She stumbled backward, her shoulders colliding with a tree. The bark felt damp and strange, as if the forest itself was breathing against her. In the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a flash of pale gray in the shadows. She whipped her head toward it, but it was gone. Her eyes scanned the trees, her pulse pounding. There was no sign of what she'd seen, but her instincts screamed that something was there. Watching. Waiting. Another step backward, and her boots sank into soft earth. She looked down and saw the faintest depression in the soil, as if something heavy had pressed against it recently. Her mind raced. A bear? No, too large, too deliberate. Whatever made that imprint was heavier, more deliberate, and it hadn't just passed by, it had been standing there, watching her. Suddenly the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The voices overlapped, creating a low hum that resonated in her chest. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it did little to block them out. The words were garbled now, fast and frantic. She couldn't make sense of them, but their intent was clear. Stay. Stay with us. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice cracking. Her words were swallowed by the hum, the forest echoing them back in distorted fragments. Her body felt heavy, like the ground beneath her was pulling her down. The whispering surged, blending with a low growl that vibrated in the air. Her vision blurred, and she swore the shadows were moving. Not just swaying with the faint breeze, but shifting, reaching out toward her. Her breath came in shallow gasps. It was no longer just a sense of being watched. Something was there. Something was waiting. She gathered every ounce of strength and bolted. Her legs felt sluggish, her movements clumsy, but she forced herself forward. The ground sloped down again, and she half ran, half slid down the incline. The whispers thinned as she gained speed, and for a moment hope flickered. Maybe she was outrunning it. Maybe it couldn't follow her down the hill. Maybe... Her foot caught on a root, and she hit the ground hard, her shoulders slamming against the dirt. Stars burst in her vision, and for a moment she lay there stunned. The silence returned, even deeper than before, like a blanket smothering the air. When she finally lifted her head, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the patch of soil where she had fallen, the imprint of her body was surrounded by other depressions. Footprints, large and heavy, pressed deep into the earth. They weren't human. They weren't anything she could recognize. And they weren't old. They were fresh. Her eyes darted up, scanning the shadows. The forest remained still, eerily quiet. But in the distance, through the gnarled trunks and tangled branches, she saw the faintest glow of orange light. A campfire, another hiker, relief and fear warred within her. She had to move. Staying here wasn't an option. With trembling hands, she pushed herself up and stumbled toward the light. The orange glow flickered like a mirage as Lila stumbled toward it, her legs still shaky from the fall. Each step seemed to take forever. The forest around her remained oppressively silent, the air growing colder the closer she got to the light. She told herself it was just another hiker's campfire, but that small voice of reason was drowned out by the gnawing unease that had taken root in her chest. When the trees finally parted, the source of the light was not what she expected. Instead of a fire, she found a small, weather-beaten cabin. It stood alone in the clearing, its wooden slats warped and graying with age. A single lantern hung on a rusted hook by the door, its weak flame casting jittery shadows over the uneven ground. The windows were dark, their glass cracked, and the front door hung slightly ajar. Lila hesitated. Her instincts urged her to turn back to find another way. But where could she go? She was hopelessly lost. The forest had turned against her, and the whispers had resumed their faint, insistent hum. This place, at least, might offer shelter, if only for a moment. The cabin's porch creaked under her boots. Her hand trembled as she pushed the door open, the old hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of mildew and something faintly metallic. The room was sparsely furnished, a single wooden chair, a rickety table, and a small fireplace filled with ash. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and a faint layer of dust coated every surface. Then she noticed the book. It lay in the center of the table, its cover warped and stained, its pages yellowed with time. The sight of it made her pause. The whispers outside the cabin had stopped the moment she stepped through the door. But now, standing here, she felt a new kind of unease. She approached the book slowly, her footsteps muffled by the worn wooden floor. The handwriting inside was uneven, scrawled in a dark ink that had bled into the brittle pages. The first few entries seemed ordinary enough. Notes on the weather, mentions of hunting trips, and observations about the woods. But as she flipped further, the tone changed. The writer, whoever they were, began to talk about the lake. "The whispers started today," one entry read. "I thought it was the wind, but they called my name. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, even when I'm inside." Lila's breath caught. The handwriting grew more frantic as she turned the pages. The entries became shorter, more erratic. "Can't leave. Every path leads back to the lake. The voices are louder now. They're not whispers anymore. They laugh when I try to run. I saw it tonight. It rose from the water, its eyes. Why won't it let me go? Why me? Why Lila?" She froze. Her name. The book fell from her hands, landing open on the table. Her stomach twisted as she stared at the page. The entry was dated 50 years ago, yet it named her. The handwriting, desperate and jagged, seemed to plead with her through the decades. How could this be possible? She'd never been here before, had never even heard of this place until the day she found it on an obscure hiking forum. The room seemed to grow colder, the air denser, pressing down on her. She backed away from the table, her heart pounding, her breath quick and shallow. A creak from the corner made her spin around, but nothing was there, just the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. She caught her reflection in its distorted surface, wide-eyed, pale, her face smudged with dirt. She stepped closer, unable to look away. The reflection didn't match her movements. Lila lifted her hand, but the image remained still, staring at her with an expression of mounting terror. She froze as the reflection's lips moved, silently at first. Then the words became clear. "Leave now." Her chest tightened. The voice wasn't hers, wasn't anyone she recognized, yet it carried a tone of urgency that rattled her to her core. She took a step back, her boot catching on the edge of the table. The book fell closed with a soft thud, as if sealing away the warnings within. Before she could think, before she could make sense of anything, the lantern flickered, its weak light sputtering. Shadows danced wildly across the room, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something in the corner of her eye, a pale figure hunched near the fireplace, its back turned to her, unmoving. She blinked, and it was gone. The lantern's flame went out. Darkness enveloped the cabin. Lila scrambled for the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She threw it open, plunging into the clearing, the cold night air cutting against her skin. But the moment she stepped outside, she froze. The whispers had returned. They came from every direction, echoing in her head. Lila. And now they were not just voices. They were a presence, closing in around her like a noose. The light of the lantern had gone out, and the forest was darker than ever. The trees loomed taller, their shadows long and reaching. The clearing itself seemed smaller, as if the forest was closing in on her. She ran blindly, the voices chasing her, whispering her name over and over, until she could no longer tell if they were coming from the forest, from the cabin, or from her own mind. Lila ran until the icy air burned her throat, and the stabbing ache in her side forced her to stop. Her legs shook as she dropped to her knees, the pine needle carpet of the forest pressing into her palms. She had no idea how far she had fled from the cabin, no idea if she had even escaped whatever had been inside. Her only thought was that she couldn't hear the whispers anymore. For the first time since she had found that cursed lake, the world was utterly, unnaturally silent. She glanced over her shoulder. The forest behind her stood dark and still. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above, casting faint patches of light that offered no real comfort. There was no sign of movement, no flicker of pale shadows, no sound of that guttural laughter that had followed her earlier. Maybe she was safe, maybe this was finally the end of it. But as her pulse began to slow, she felt it again, that pull, the feeling that something was drawing her forward, deeper into the woods. It wasn't the whispering voices now, it was something subtler, a gnawing curiosity that refused to let her turn back. She hated herself for it, but she pushed herself to her feet and kept walking, her steps slow and deliberate. The trees seemed different now. Their twisted shapes were less intimidating, though the sight of them still set her on edge. They were older, their bark split and gnarled, their roots coiling above the ground like veins. As she moved forward, she noticed something glinting faintly in the distance. It wasn't the light of the lantern or any natural glow. It was sharper, colder. It took her a moment to realize what it was. Another mirror. This one was larger than the cracked pane she had seen in the cabin. It was mounted in the middle of a tree. No, it was part of the tree, the bark grown around its edges as if the forest itself had swallowed it. The glass was old and tarnished, its surface cloudy and warped, but it reflected just enough moonlight to stand out in the gloom. Lila hesitated, her hand hovering in midair. Her first instinct was to turn and run, but her legs wouldn't obey. Something about the mirror drew her closer. Her reflection came into view as she approached, her dirt-smeared face pale and wide-eyed. She felt her breathing slow as she stared into the glass, unable to look away. The forest behind her looked warped in the reflection, the trees twisting and stretching in impossible ways. Her own face seemed wrong. Her features were there, her brown hair, her green eyes, but something in the reflection's expression didn't match what she was feeling. It looked frightened. No, it looked terrified. She reached out without thinking, her fingers brushing the cold glass. Her reflection jerked back from her touch, its eyes widening in panic. She gasped and stumbled away, but the mirror stayed rooted in the tree, unmoving. She tried to turn, tried to flee, but her body wouldn't respond. Her reflection pressed its hands against the other side of the glass, mouthing words she couldn't hear. It took her a moment to realize that the mirror wasn't silent after all. There was a faint, hollow noise, as if the sound was trapped behind the glass. She leaned closer, her ear just inches from the surface. The sound grew louder. It wasn't wind, wasn't static. It was the same whispering she had heard at the lake, the same voices calling her name. She flinched and stumbled back, but the voices kept growing, louder and more insistent. They weren't coming from the forest. They were coming from the mirror. Her reflection pounded against the glass now, as if it were trying to warn her. She turned to run, but something stopped her. Another voice. This one was clear, not a whisper, not a chorus. It was a single voice that spoke with urgent clarity. Leave. It was her reflection. The words didn't match her own lips. They came from the glass itself. Her reflection's eyes were wide with fear, its mouth forming the words over and over until the glass began to ripple. The mirror's surface shifted, the reflection blurring, stretching, and then shattering into 1,000 shards. The sound was deafening. The pieces of glass fell to the forest floor, but there was no clatter, no crunch, just a horrible silence, like the forest was holding its breath again. She didn't wait to see what would happen next. She turned and ran, the echo of her reflection's warning ringing in her ears. The forest grew darker, colder. The path twisted in ways that defied logic, but she kept moving. The silence pressed in, her footfalls the only sound in the oppressive stillness. But no matter how far she ran, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still behind her, watching, waiting. Lila forced herself to keep moving, her reflection's warning pounding in her head like a drumbeat. The air grew colder, damp and heavy as Lila stumbled through the forest, every step feeling more sluggish than the last. Her body wanted to collapse, but the thought of stopping, of giving that thing the chance to catch up, kept her moving. Still, her surroundings were changing, and not in ways she could explain. The forest had turned hostile. The trees twisted unnaturally, their limbs arching like skeletal arms reaching for her. What should have been solid ground gave way to patches of slippery moss and uneven roots that threatened to trip her at every step. The dim light that filtered through the canopy seemed to have taken on a sickly hue, casting the undergrowth in shades of gray and green that churned her stomach. Lila didn't know how long she'd been walking. The path, or what she thought was the path, had disappeared long ago. Every direction seemed the same: gnarled trees, dark underbrush, and an oppressive quiet that wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud. She tried to focus on her breathing, to keep herself calm, but it was impossible. With each step, she could hear the faintest crunch of leaves behind her. Soft, slow, methodical, her heart thundered. She knew she wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was following her. She tightened her grip on the small, dull pocket knife she'd taken from her pack hours earlier. It was no real defense, but the cold weight of it in her palm gave her a fragile sense of control. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. They were deliberate now, not the scurrying of an animal or the scattered rustling of leaves in the wind. They were measured, as though whatever was following her knew exactly how far ahead she was. It didn't run. It didn't need to. Lila's mind raced. If she broke into a full sprint, would it give chase? Would it attack? She didn't know. Her fear made every choice seem like the wrong one, every step like it carried her closer to something inevitable. She glanced over her shoulder and saw nothing but shadows, but the weight of the unseen eyes bore down on her like a physical force. The whispers were back, not as loud as before, but there, faint, just on the edge of her hearing. They slipped through the trees, rising and falling with an unnatural rhythm. They didn't call her name this time. Instead, they hissed and murmured something she couldn't understand, a language that seemed ancient and raw. She tried to shut it out, but the words slipped past her ears and into her head, making her feel dizzy and lightheaded. Then she saw it just for a moment, a shadow taller than the trees, flickering at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, but it was gone. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't her imagination. Something was here, something that was not just following her, but hunting her. Her legs burned as she pushed on, her breaths coming in short gasps. The footsteps stayed steady, never speeding up, never slowing down, always just behind her, always out of sight. She could feel it watching, even when she couldn't see it. The forest seemed to shift as she moved, the trees leaning closer, the path curling into itself. She realized with a sick certainty that she was going in circles. A burst of panic sent her running. The knife slipped from her hand and disappeared into the underbrush, but she didn't stop to retrieve it. Her legs pumped furiously, and the footsteps finally quickened, matching her pace. They were heavier now, louder, the sound filling her ears and driving out every thought except escape. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away. Her foot snagged on a root, and she went down hard, her knees slamming into the dirt. Pain shot through her legs, but the terror outweighed the pain. She rolled onto her back, clutching at the ground, expecting to see it towering over her, but there was nothing. Only the dark trees and the cold air pressing against her skin. She pushed herself up, trembling, and glanced behind her. The footsteps were gone. The forest was silent again, but she knew better than to trust it. The thing that had been following her wasn't gone. It had just stopped, waiting, watching. The whispers returned, louder now, a chaotic symphony of voices that seemed to come from all around her. They filled her mind, drowning out her thoughts. Her legs felt heavy, her movements sluggish. She stumbled forward, desperate to escape the sound, desperate to find some place that wasn't this twisted, unending forest. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A faint light. She couldn't tell if it was natural or man-made. It flickered weakly, like a dying flame, but it was the first sign of anything other than darkness she had seen in what felt like hours. She hesitated, her instincts warring with her desperation. The light could mean safety, or it could mean another trap. But she had no other choice. She forced her legs to move, following the faint glow. The whispers grew louder, angrier. The sound of footsteps returned, now heavy and rapid, closing in. Her breath caught in her throat as she pushed toward the light, knowing that whatever was behind her wouldn't stop until it had her. The flickering light drew Lila forward like a beacon. She staggered toward it, every nerve in her body screaming at her to keep going, to reach that fragile illumination before the footsteps could close in. The whispers were deafening now, a chaotic whirlwind of voices swirling in her ears. But she forced herself to block them out. Her entire focus narrowed to that pale, wavering glow just beyond the twisted trees. As she neared, the light resolved into something more tangible. A small, open clearing illuminated by what looked like a single lantern resting atop a weathered wooden post. It cast a faint orange halo across the forest floor, creating sharp shadows that flickered and writhed as if alive. Beyond the circle of light, the forest loomed like a wall of darkness, impenetrable and cold. But here, within the glow, it felt as though the oppressive weight of the whispers lessened. For the first time in what felt like hours, Lila's chest loosened, allowing her a full breath. She stumbled into the clearing and stopped just beneath the lantern. Its weak light seemed to push back the worst of the shadows, giving her a sliver of hope that she might have found safety. But that hope was short-lived. The whispers didn't fade entirely. Instead, they shifted. They no longer sounded random. They began to chant. The voices, overlapping and discordant, spoke her name in a rhythmic cadence, over and over. Lila, Layla. It was hypnotic, wrapping around her mind like a suffocating blanket. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did nothing to block them out. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside her head, a malevolent presence that wouldn't let her go. And then she saw it. At the edge of the clearing, where the lantern's light bled into shadow, a figure emerged. Tall, impossibly tall, it moved with an unsettling grace. Its body was obscured by the darkness, but its glowing eyes pierced the gloom. They burned faintly, like embers, casting a faint reddish light that reflected off the ground. The figure stopped just at the threshold of the clearing, as if testing the light's boundary. Lila took a step back, her heart pounding. The figure tilted its head, studying her. It was humanoid in shape, but elongated and wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid. It exuded a presence that made her skin crawl, as if the shadows themselves clung to it, feeding off its existence. The whispers grew louder, rising to a crescendo. Lila's name came faster, harsher, as though the voices were urging the figure forward. "You shouldn't have come," the creature said. Its voice was a low rasp, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the chanting like a blade. "You were warned." Lila's throat went dry. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She wanted to ask what it was, why it was here, what it wanted, but the words wouldn't form. All she could do was take another step back, her legs trembling so violently that she felt they might give out beneath her. The creature took one step forward, just one. The lantern's light brushed against its form, and for a fleeting moment, Lila could see it more clearly. Its body was skeletal, the skin stretched tight over its bones. Dark veins crisscrossed its limbs, pulsing faintly, and its face was shrouded in shadow, except for those glowing eyes. A faint grin spread across what might have been its mouth, an expression that carried no warmth, no humor, only malice. "You shouldn't have come," it repeated, the grin widening. "Now you'll stay." It stepped fully into the light, and the lantern flickered as though recoiling from its presence. The whispers erupted into screams, 100 voices shrieking in unison. Lila's hands flew to her head, trying to block out the noise, but it was overwhelming. The creature raised one long arm and pointed at her, the grin twisting into something monstrous. "You'll stay with us forever." The lantern sputtered, the light dimming as the creature moved closer. The shadows of the forest seemed to shift in response, creeping toward the clearing as if eager to swallow her whole. Lila's fight-or-flight instinct kicked in, and she turned on her heel, sprinting away from the light and into the darkness beyond. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could hear it moving behind her, its footsteps heavier now, faster. The ground seemed to shift beneath her feet, roots and rocks appearing out of nowhere. But she didn't stop. The voices screamed louder, urging her to run, to escape, to flee. But no matter how fast she went, she could feel it gaining on her. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The forest itself seemed to conspire against her, twisting and folding in ways that defied logic. Lila's lungs burned, her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't dare slow down. She knew if she did, it would catch her, and if it caught her, she would never leave these woods. She would never leave that thing. The whispers morphed into a harsh cacophony of sound, rising and falling like the tide, threatening to drown out Lila's own thoughts. She had no idea how long she had been running, minutes, hours, it all blended together. The forest around her blurred into a tangle of twisted trunks and swaying shadows. Every step felt heavier, every breath more labored. Her body begged her to stop, but the thing pursuing her never slowed. It stayed out of sight, just beyond the edge of her vision. Sometimes she caught a flicker of movement, a shadow darting behind a tree, a pale glint of those glowing eyes, but never long enough to focus. It wasn't playing with her. It was waiting for her to tire, to stumble, to give up. Lila's foot caught on a root, and she pitched forward, hitting the ground hard. Pine needles dug into her palms as she scrambled to her knees, her chest heaving. She twisted around, expecting to see it right behind her, but there was nothing, just the forest, silent and still. The whispers had stopped. She scanned the shadows, her heart pounding. It was too quiet, too still. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she strained to hear something, anything. She couldn't let herself believe it was gone. She knew better. The silence wasn't safety. It was the calm before something worse. Then came a sound, soft, deliberate, a single step somewhere just beyond her sight line. Lila froze, her body tensing. Another step, closer this time. She forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling, and turned in the direction of the noise. The forest was dark, the trees tightly packed, their twisted forms casting long, jagged shadows. And then she felt it. A presence, heavy and suffocating, pressing down on her like a storm cloud. It was standing there, just beyond her sight, waiting. Lila's eyes darted around, desperate for something she could use as a weapon, but all she saw were broken branches and scattered leaves. The footsteps resumed, slow and measured, circling her. She turned with them, her breath coming in short gasps, but she couldn't see it. It stayed in the shadows, out of reach, out of view. Her body screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. She realized, with a sickening clarity, that it was toying with her. It didn't need to rush. It was already certain of its prize. Finally, the footsteps stopped and the silence returned. Lila's chest tightened as she turned in a slow circle, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it could hear. She could feel it now, so close she swore she could reach out and touch it. The air around her was colder, denser, as if the shadows themselves were thickening. She knew it was there, standing just behind her. Watching, the whispering returned, but this time it wasn't a chaotic chorus. It was a single voice, deep and guttural. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You've come so far, Lila. Don't stop now." Her stomach twisted. The voice wasn't unfamiliar, it was her own, but twisted, distorted, spoken by something that had no right to use it. She clamped her hands over her ears, but it didn't stop. The words were inside her head now, echoing through her mind. "Keep going. There's no use running." A flicker of movement in the corner of her vision made her whirl around. For the briefest moment she saw it, a tall, skeletal figure, pale and slick, like something born of the water. Its glowing eyes bored into her, and its mouth curled into a jagged, unnatural grin. And then it was gone again, dissolving into the shadows like smoke. "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're not real." The laughter returned, low and rumbling, blending with her own voice in a mockery of sound. "I'm more real than you think. You've seen the lake, haven't you? You've heard the whispers, you know." The memory of the lake rose unbidden in her mind, the still, black water that had started it all. She could see the ripples again, could hear that first whisper calling her name. She shook her head, trying to drive the image away, but it clung to her like a stain. "Come back to the lake, Lila," the voice said. "Come home." Her legs finally obeyed her. She turned and ran, her feet pounding against the forest floor. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony that filled her mind. The air felt thicker, the shadows closer, and no matter how far she ran, that oppressive presence remained behind her, relentless. She didn't dare look back. She didn't need to. She could feel it there, the hunter that never tired, always just out of sight, always closing in. And with each step, her strength waned, her body threatening to give out. The forest seemed endless, a maze that offered no escape, no end, only the certainty that the thing behind her would never stop. "Come back," the voice said again, softer now. "It's where you belong. Lila's breath caught as the shadows ahead of her deepened. In the distance, she saw it again, the faint glimmer of water. The lake. It was waiting for her, just as it had been from the beginning. The path led straight to it, as if the forest itself had been guiding her back all along. The lake came into view, shrouded in that same eerie mist that seemed to roll off its surface like smoke. The black water gleamed faintly in the dim light of the moon, utterly still except for the faint ripples that spread outward from an unseen source. The air grew colder with each step Lila took, her legs moving as though controlled by something other than her own will. She couldn't tell if she was running to the lake or being pulled toward it. All she knew was that she had reached the end of her flight. The whispers had stopped entirely now. The forest around her was silent, the oppressive quiet of a place abandoned by sound, by life. Her breath hung in the air, clouding the view ahead of her. She reached the shore, her boots sinking into the mud, and stopped. The stillness was suffocating. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. Then, from the center of the lake, a shape began to rise. It emerged slowly, as if the water itself was unwilling to let it go. First, a pale, glistening hand broke the surface, followed by an impossibly long arm. A head followed, its features obscured by the mist, though the faint glow of those terrible eyes pierced the darkness. The figure stood, its thin, bony body barely visible against the water's black surface. It didn't move toward her. It didn't have to. Its presence alone was enough to root her to the spot, her pulse racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "You came back," it said. Its voice was a low, resonant murmur that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You were always meant to." Lila tried to speak, to protest, but no words came out. The creature tilted its head, a slow, deliberate movement. It took a single step toward her, and she felt the ground beneath her shift, as though the lake itself was moving to meet her. She stumbled backward, but there was nowhere to run. The forest was a black wall behind her, and ahead, the lake stretched endlessly. "You heard the whispers," it continued. "You followed them here. You were called." "No," she finally managed, her voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't want this." "But you did," it said, its voice rising. "You felt it your whole life, that pull, that longing. This place has always been part of you, and now you are part of it." The shadows seemed to grow deeper, the air colder. Lila shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "Please, let me go." The creature stepped closer. The ripples spread out from its feet, reaching the shore, touching her boots. She felt the cold seeping into her, numbing her legs. Its glowing eyes locked onto hers, and she felt her strength draining, her mind clouding. The whispers returned, faint and insistent, repeating the same phrase over and over. "Stay, stay, stay. You can't leave," it said, its voice no longer menacing but calm, final. "No one ever does." Lila's knees buckled, and she fell into the mud, her hands sinking into the cold, wet earth. Her breath came in sobs as the creature loomed over her, the last barrier of resistance crumbling. The water reached up the shore now, lapping at her knees, her waist, pulling her closer. She felt the tug not just on her body, but on her mind, her very being. The lake wanted her. It always had. The whispers rose to a scream, a single voice cutting through them. "Don't give in." It was faint, distant, but unmistakably her own. Lila blinked, her vision clearing for just a moment. She saw herself, not in the water, but standing at the edge of the trees, staring back at her with wide, desperate eyes. "Fight it!" the other Lila shouted. "It's not real. None of it is real." The creature turned toward the sound, its glowing eyes narrowing. Lila felt a sudden surge of strength, a desperate, last-ditch surge of willpower. She clawed at the mud, trying to pull herself free of the water's grasp. The whispers turned angry, screaming in 100 different voices, telling her to stop, to stay, to let go. But she didn't. She forced herself to her feet, her legs trembling, the water pulling at her like hands trying to drag her down. She stumbled backward, step by painful step, until she felt the solid ground of the forest beneath her. The whispers grew faint and the creature hissed, its glowing eyes narrowing to slits. "This isn't over," it said, its voice sharp, cutting. "You'll be back." But Lila didn't look back. She turned and ran, her body screaming in pain, her breath burning in her throat. The forest blurred around her, the trees a dark, endless tunnel. The whispers faded, replaced by the sound of her own pounding footsteps. Finally, she broke through the trees into the cold, open night air. She collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping for breath, the oppressive presence gone. When she finally looked up, she saw the stars overhead, clear and bright. The forest behind her was silent. The lake, for now, was gone. But deep down, Lila knew it wasn't over. The lake had called her once. It would call her again.